Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 91. Today will be our third short story episode. These episodes are fun in that they gather odds and ends and pieces that don't fit other places. Sometimes it's a winery, topic, or person that can't support a full episode but is still worth knowing about. Other times it's short articles that I find interesting. This episode will be a collection of magazine and newspaper articles, old book excerpts, and a wine poem written by an early San Francisco writer and gastronome. Some of these also expose us to just other types of wine writing or the styles that were popular at the time in magazines and books. A reminder that I have a Patreon at patreon.com/indiewinepodcast. The link is in the show notes also. If you're enjoying the podcast, any amount to help me keep telling wine stories ad-free and available for everyone is appreciated. Telling a friend or sharing it on social media are great ways to help out too. It's all run independently and does rely a lot on listener support. Okay, here we go. I'm going to start off with an excerpt from a book titled My Vineyard at Lakeview by a Western Grapegrower. Our author is anonymous. The book was printed in 1866, and the West that is referred to is Ohio. Originally from Connecticut, the author settled with his family in Lakeview, Ohio, a small town on a small lake in western central Ohio. This is a 40-some acre farm, and he gives a detailed rundown of his progress each year in converting it to a vineyard, fixing up the home and barn and more. Delaware, Catawba, Isabella, Clinton, Concord, 6 of Rogers' hybrids, Allen's hybrid, Anna, Diana, and Rebecca were some of the grapes he grew. Among these, Delaware was his favorite, quote, combining more good qualities than any other, unquote. The book is a pretty quick and entertaining read, filled with wisdom of the day and not too different from many others. I think a little more personality shines through it, though, than in most of the similar books. The part that really jumps out is the chapter I'll read, Autobiography of a Vine. As the title suggests, it's written from the point of view of a vine in this Lakeview vineyard. This is a more artistic and self-indulgent touch that you rarely get in these usually straightforward facts types of books, usually written by pioneers of some type. The book is available online also if you're interested in reading it. Chapter 14. Autobiography of a Vine. On one occasion, not long ago, I visited a friend who has a small number of vines which are perfect models in form and vigor. One of them was particularly remarkable for its symmetry. If that vine, I remarked, were to tell its own story, it would be one of great care and untiring attention. Not very great, my friend replied, and as to telling its own story, I see no reason why it should not. I frequently talk to it while engaged in the work of bringing it up in the way it should go. Not many days afterwards, I received the following paper, bearing the title that I have placed at the commencement of this chapter. When very young, I know not how old indeed, but nearly as far back as my memory goes, you would have called me a bud in those days, I used to take great delight in the anticipation of future enjoyment. My father was a venerable vine, kindly in disposition and well-to-do in the world. His roots penetrated the soil far and wide, where abundant nourishment for his whole family was easily gathered. What a splendid time, so I soliloquized, while I have the whole of next season. It was now fall. Nothing to do in the way of obtaining food for myself, no searching the dark soil here and there for delicate titbits, nothing of the kind. My venerable papa will do all that. My only task will be to put forth a few leaves and digest the nourishment which will be so abundantly furnished. The gentle summer showers will refresh me when I'm thirsty. The genial sunshine will warm me when cold, and the cooling breezes will fan me when the heat becomes oppressive. What a continued scene of enjoyment will my life present! I can scarcely await the slow approach of spring, so that I can enter upon it. But the force of circumstances were quite overpowering, so I settled down for a long winter's repose. But alas, for any calculation which could be made regarding the affairs of this transitory world, I had scarcely fallen to sleep when awakened by the noise of voices and conversation. They came from the gardener and his assistant. "Here, Patrick," said the first, "cut all of these vines through here down to 2 buds, and save all the well-ripened wood for single bud cuttings." "Sure, and I'll do the same," was the willing response of the other. Not many minutes had passed before the sharp knife of Patrick had taken me and many of my brothers away from the protecting care of our respected ancestor. Where now, thought I, are all the fine calculations for next year's enjoyment? But I said nothing, consoling myself with the reflection that the society of my brothers was still left me. Some time after, a number of us were taken up and carried into a propagating house, a strange-looking building with a glass roof. The air was warm, almost uncomfortably so. On one side was a long bench covered with sand, made still warmer than the air of the house by means of what they called bottom heat. I had scarcely made these observations when the self-same bloodthirsty Patrick came along with his knife and deprived me of my only remaining consolation, by separating me entirely from all kindred. I recalled to mind an old saying that misfortunes never come singly, and thought what a fine illustration my fate afforded of its truth. Presently they took me to the bench, and putting me in the sand in a slanting kind of way, covered me completely up. Buried alive, thought I, and at the same time wondered why they failed to make this last misfortune complete by not putting me in head downwards. But they did not do it, and herein was a slight shadow of consolation, only it was so dark in there that I could hardly see the shadow. For several days I kept very quiet, waiting for something to turn up, but nothing happened, or seemed likely to. So I put up a leaf or two above the sand to see what was going on. Among my first experiences was a drink of water which Patrick was kind enough to give. What a comment is this, thought I, upon those anticipated enjoyments. Instead of the gentle summer showers which were to refresh me all so nice, the incorrigible Patrick comes along and gives me a little sprinkle from a tin watering pot. And thus it is, frequently in life. The fine castles that we build, grand and gorgeous to look upon, too often in the reality are only plain houses, and even these sometimes with broken windows and a leaky roof. Before many days I began to get quite hungry. I was now dependent on my own resources, not having the kind papa to get me food as I had anticipated. So I put out a few roots in the sand to see what could be found, and poor picking it was, you can rest assured. I believe I should have starved to death if it had not been for the food my venerable papa had surrounded me with before I was taken from his hospitable trellis. But I had hardly commenced wondering what would become of me, when who should come along but Patrick, and taking me from the sand, placed me in a nice little pot, filled with the richest soil. What a feast was that! A regular Thanksgiving. There was such a nice lot of food close at hand, that being thrown on my own resources did not seem so bad a thing after all. I grew quite rapidly, and it was not long before I felt crowded in my new abode. My roots had nearly filled the pot, so that there was hardly a chance to stir. This inconvenience had not lasted long when the inevitable Patrick, whom I had learned to look upon with some degree of favor, took me out and placed me in a larger pot. This was a sensible operation, as I had outgrown the old one, much as a schoolboy outgrows a pair of shoes. In my new abode, I continued to grow strong and vigorous. It was not long, however, before spring arrived. I was now taken from the pod and placed with a great number of companions in a bed out of doors. This bed had been prepared with the greatest care. It was mellow and dry and warm, and the supply of food was so abundant that it required no great exertion to get all we wanted. On the whole, we passed the summer very pleasantly. They gave us but little care, And I should say that we did not need more because many of us were at least 5 feet tall at the close of the season. When we were planted, they gave us a good mulching of coarse barnyard manure, and then let us shift for ourselves, except that they pulled out a few large weeds, which made a very obvious display of large capacities for stealing our food. At the approach of cold weather, they cut us all down to about 4 buds, dug us out of the bed, and healed us in, covering us afterwards entirely with earth. Early next spring, some of us were taken out, packed in moss, and sent some distance by rail. Without any remarkable incidents on the journey, we arrived here, and I was shortly afterwards planted in the very spot where you see me now. The first summer passed very pleasantly. The soil must have been nicely prepared. It was so exceedingly mellow that my roots could get around with the greatest ease. There was a little lime which I was glad to get hold of now and then, because I am as fond of it as most people are of salt. During the season, I grew pretty much according to my own notion, except that when they thought a lateral was getting a little too long, they stopped it. In the fall, they came along with pruning shears, which they used in a careless sort of way, as is proven by the fact that they cut me back to only 15 inches in height. A mighty pretty way that is to barber a fellow, thought I. But as it seemed to be quite the fashion among all my neighbors, I did not so much care. The next spring they came along and rubbed off all but my 2 upper buds. From these I produced 2 very stout canes during the season, the laterals being pretty closely pinched in. Feeling somewhat ambitious, I produced this season a couple bunches of fruit, whereabout I felt as much pride as a boy does with his first whiskers, or a hen over her first egg. The gardener who had charge of me in those days felt very much gratified, and I suppose he was entitled to some reward for all the trouble he had been in taking care of me. But if he had left me more alone and not cut and pinched me so much, I am sure I should have been equally well gratified. Perhaps trials and tribulations are necessary to the proper development of character. It is at least a true philosophy of life to count all afflictions as blessings in disguise. And if these disguises, as sometimes happens, are so well put on that the blessings are not recognized, we must still exercise our faith that they are there, and that all things are working together for good. In the fall, these 2 canes of mine were shortened to 4 feet. The next spring, this was my 3rd year in the vineyard, they built a trellis of 5 wires attached to posts, so that the lower wire was 14 inches from the ground. On this lower wire, they fastened the 2 canes in opposite directions and called them arms. And now, what do you think was done next? All of the buds on the underside of the arms were rubbed off. But from each of the buds on the upper side, a cane was allowed to grow, making 6 canes on an arm. These canes were tied to the trellis as they grew, and the laterals kept pretty well shortened in. Feeling somewhat in the fruiting way, I produced 1 or 2 bunches of fruit on each cane, about 20 in all, but I did not feel so proud of them as I had done of the 2 bunches the previous year. At the fall pruning, the gardener cut off all the canes down to 2 buds. This bit of cane which he had left on, he called a spur. And there I stood, the whole winter through, with arms outstretched to their fullest extent. It would have become quite fatiguing had not the trellis afforded me a good support. The next, the 4th year of my vineyard life, a cane was produced from each of the 2 buds left on the spurs, making a dozen canes to an arm. These were treated precisely as those of last season, but the amount of fruit I produced was very much increased. I think there must have been some 60 or 70 bunches in all. In the fall, each alternate cane was cut entirely away, and the rest down to 2 buds. From that day to this, my life has been simply a repetition of my 4th year's experience. Many good crops of fruit have I borne, but I do not feel exhausted, or that old age is creeping upon me. Indeed, When I recall to mind the stories I used to hear Father tell of some of our ancestors who had rejoiced in the summer sun of half a dozen centuries, the notion creeps over me that I shall live and bear my fruit for at least 100 years to come. This next one is titled Sonoma's Viticultural Jubilee. It was written by Charles Bundshu in 1908. We last heard some of his writings in the CWA episode number 4, the Calamity Edition. He documented the 1906 earthquake from both a winemaker and a citizen point of view. He really is a great writer, and this article was published by the Pacific Wine and Spirits Review. It's him reminiscing slightly about the Sonoma of the past and what its present is like. Sonoma's Viticultural Jubilee. Sonoma's Viticultural Jubilee. About a fortnight ago, business matters took me up to Sonoma Valley, beyond Glen Ellen. I had not visited this section for some years, and never before did the changes that time had wrought here appeal to me so impressively. My first drive through this most beautiful part of Sonoma Valley dates back 45 years ago. Youth and inspiration, the youthful vigor of this then newly developing wine district, and my own juvenile inspiration under such attractive surroundings left an everlasting impression. Hospitality and social intercourse were then, as they may be now in a modified way, the keynotes of old Sonoma Valley. Ask those who may be fortunate enough to remember, because it is a rather long ago, how congenial and hospitable the spirit was that dominated Sonoma in these early days of pioneer viticultural life. The home of the Hood family at Los Guillocos, the Harastis, the Lamotes, the Warfields, the Stewarts, Major Snyder, Major Chimordani, Herman Waller, McPherson Hill, Emil and Julius Dressel, the Gunlock family, and many others loom up cheerfully out of this cycle of early recollection. Today, the eye meets meditatingly the same old locations, scattered about the various hillsides. But the proprietary rights and owners have mostly changed, and with them the old spirit has passed away. 2 railroad lines have since trailed the valley from south to north. Near one of the stations, the line crosses the estate of the late Colonel Hooper, now the property of Rudolph Spreckles. He already spent a fortune to develop the place into a modern country home under unique surroundings. When he purchased this ideal haven of rest, he little thought of the strenuous work his acted life had still in store for him. Further on, Consul Eli T. Shepard's magnificent Madrone Vineyard home looms up. Sold by him to the Hearst family, and now the property of a corporation. The pitiful sight of the toppling ruins of the cellar buildings are remindful of the fatal effect the great earthquake has produced in this section. Then Chauvet's old winery and cellar, erected years ago by Schilling & Co. near Glen Ellen, strikes the view. And then a few miles further beyond, the old family homes of the Warfields, Hoods, Major Drummonds, the old Jim Shaw place stands forth. I still remember some 20 years ago, when on a misty January morning I came across the congenial figure of this open-hearted, good-natured vineyardist planting an orange grove near his house. His old friend Hamilton assisted him. Ah, the orange grove. And then the owner of the place did not thrive any too well thereafter. But the vineyard he had planted proved prosperous. One after another, the old landmarks of a bygone era remind us of the serious struggles of many proud families, whose junior members have mostly left the old family places, scattered in many directions. Under these reminiscent surroundings, the thought came to me that the year 1908 marked Sonoma's golden jubilee of her viticultural aspirations. In the spring of 1858, the first vineyards of any formidable extent were planted near the old town of Sonoma. They were principally devoted to the culture of the mission grape, but soon thereafter the exquisite varieties of Rhenish types were introduced. The leading spirit of this early enterprise was the enthusiastic Hungarian, Colonel Augustin Haraszti, father of the late Arpad Haraszti, whose interesting early publications on his travels throughout the wine districts of Europe are well remembered. His large vineyard estate formed the nucleus of the ill-fated Buena Vista Viticultural Society, whose leading men, among them its president, Mr. B.E. Auger, sacrificed energy and fortune on the uncertain venture of winemaking and production of natural champagne. The Zinfandel grape found its origin in Colonel Hrosty, who imported it from Europe. But the name of this successful variety still stands as an unexplained corruption of some undefined original specialty. The white wine cuttings were imported from Bingen on the Rhine and Johannesburg in 1859 by Jacob Gunlock and Emil Dressel, the originators of Rhine Farm, now the property of the Gunlock Bundshu Wine Company, Incorporated. Many years of hard-fought battles have since passed over this pioneer era of California's viticulture. The phylloxera devastated the flourishing vineyard estates and impoverished many of the once prosperous vineyardists. Under the strife and stress and the hardships of an uncertain future, only few have survived. They turned over their doubtful inheritance to their more hopeful and energetic successors. Sonoma Valley's glory still prevails. Its pioneer work and its unparalleled efforts to build up a noble industry still survive and are well remembered. California derived the benefit of this endless chain of sacrifices. If the bells of the old Spanish mission San Francisco de Solano de Sonoma, founded in 1824, were still in place and could speak, they would ring out the praise of bygone days and the fame and glory of this golden jubilee of old Sonoma Valley. Charles Bundshu, San Francisco, January, 1908. As we heard in the Antoine Delmas episode, the origin myth concerning Hrosty was debunked by Charles Sullivan. We'll get into the story more another time, but I love the tone of that piece of Old Sonoma by Charles. The third is titled, Peasants Rely on Wine for Weather Gauge. It's a newspaper article from 1937. It's really about wines waking up in the spring as cellars would warm up and any remaining fermentation or malolactic might reignite. I think it's a fun little short story. Peasants rely on wine for weather gauge. When an Austrian peasant wants to know whether he can safely undertake some field work requiring sunshine in the next days, he descends into a cellar and puts his ear to the wine barrels. To him, wine is not a luxury. It is on his daily bill of fare. The laborers also receive their ration of wine with their dinner. But wine is not only food and drink and occasionally a banisher of care to him, but also a barometer which he considers infallible. It is known that when the vine stands in blossom in the yards, the wine in the barrels becomes restless in its casks and begins to sing. This phenomenon has not yet been explained, nor does one know why, long before man and animal have the faintest presentiment of the coming event, the wine in Sicilian cellars becomes riotous and announces thereby the impending volcanic eruption. A change in the weather in Austria invariably is preceded by bubbles rising in the wine barrels. They produce a faint noise which one can perceive by putting an ear to the wood. To the Austrian peasant, the wine is a far more reliable announcer of weather changes than the finest barometer. This peculiar quality of wine is being scientifically investigated. Some scientists believe it has to do with atmospheric electricity, especially with short waves, while others are inclined to ascribe the strange behavior of the wine to the chemical influences. Next up is A California Vintage. This piece was discussed in the Delmas episode, but people seemed interested in the piece, so I thought I would read all of it. It's not too long, but with a great description of 1880s California winemaking from a better-than-average author, Frank Norris. He was a muckraking journalist. Probably his most important and famous work is The Octopus, about California railroad monopolies. Most of his other books deal with similar forms of corruption. This was written about 15 years before The Octopus was published, when he wrote for the San Francisco Wave. You can already hear his style mostly developed and his disdain for the tax collectors and other authorities. A California Vintage. Winemaking by machinery on a Santa Clara Valley ranch. At first sight, the making of wine on a California vineyard is a rough shock to one's preconceived notions as to what winemaking should be like. It is a disillusioning, a disenchantment. The vineyard itself is disappointing. miles and miles of low green bushes growing out of a hard, flat, dusty soil. Where you expected to see perhaps trellises and dangling bunches and trailing vines growing against creamy white walls on a sunny hillside. Then, of course, no one treads out the wine nowadays. You had some vague ideas of a process of winemaking that was picturesque, but you were unwilling to see any poetry about temperatures and percentages, about tannic acids and creams of tartar. But this unwillingness very soon wears away, and you find that the means whereby 500 tons of grapes are turned into 350,000 gallons of wine are interesting after all. That there is even a very great deal of the picturesque about these enormous machines, these mountains of grapes, these seas of wine. The vintage that I saw was not at all like the classic vintage, where oxen turned the presser, and where the young men and women wore chaplets of grape leaves and danced and played on pipes. It was not even the romantic vintage of France and northern Italy, where the grapes are pressed out by the feet, where the wine is handled in skins, and where the vintage is begun by a little religious ceremony, a little procession of the curé and the peasants. The vintage I saw was a vintage of reality, a vintage of facts and figures, of chemical processes, a naturalistic vintage, a vintage fin de siècle, and yet it was picturesque. It was at Casa Delmas, at Mountain View. The grapes were brought up to the crusher in long wagons, and each wagon was weighed in very carefully before it was unloaded. After leaving the scales, the huge wagons were halted in front of the endless chain, forever mounting and descending, and the grapes were pitchforked from hand to hand until they reached the chain itself. Then it was as though they had been caught up by a current, a great perverse current running up a hill. A vast green river steamed upwards incessantly, disappearing, whisking out of sight through the narrow slit under the roof of the building. Here is where the crusher was placed, and also the contrivance for separating the grapes from the stems, where the river, as one might say, branched. The berries going on, the stems returning, flowing downhill into enormous vats. Inside, the air was full of the noise, machinery, the coughing of pumps, the clattering of pistons and eccentrics, and the prolonged purring of dynamos. It was night. The light from the incandescent bulbs flashed back at you from the vats of wine like the convivial winking of an eye, bloodshot with drunkenness. But in the shadows, the wine looked otherwise. That is to say, it looked black, but in some way one saw at the same time that it was red. Black and red simultaneously, as blood is black and red. But what an odor! The odor of torn, mashed pulp, the odor of thick, sweet juice, rivers of it, pools, lakes of it, the reek and fume of miles of vines, the rank, crude smell of the earth's production, the welter of a whole harvest, the heart's blood of 500 acres, concentrated, poured together under one roof. It was like the smell of an apple core, long since brown, only intensified beyond all limit, and for the moment it was as overpowering as a gas. Once free of the crusher, the thick river of fruit branches variously, one branch turning on itself, like the backwash of a swift stream under the banks, and carrying the stems down and back to the great tuns. But a dozen others winding their way deviously toward the mammoth vats in distant corners. The grapes are mussed now, the juice wrung from the skins and pulps, but not yet free of them, and so far it is only juice. The wine is not yet. The tanks, thousands of gigantic, headless barrels, receive the must, and little by little each tank is filled. For a few days the must in the tanks is left to itself, and then slowly at first begins the curious thing that turns the sugared, colorless liquid into wine. The miracle, for to an outsider it seems no less strange. All of itself the must begins to grow warm. Though there is no suggestion of fire near, in a few hours it is hot, an immense, sticky, smoking mass. A little later it is boiling, bubbling with a sullen, muttering sound, a thick pink froth like the spume of a hard-bitted horse, creaming up slowly from the center, dripping over the lip of the tank. Looking down into the tank from above, one can see the whole surface of the must in slow motion, heaving and falling. It is like a miniature Vesuvius. Like a Vesuvius, too, it throws off its gas, deadly poisonous. As you bend over the tank, you can catch occasional whiffs of this gas. It is bitter, pungent, smarting, like the reek of strong ammonia. Hold the lantern near to it and the flame dies out in an instant. Positive fire damp. You are told a story of a man, a new man, inexperienced, who dropped into a newly emptied tank to clean it out. It is even claimed that he was dead before he touched the bottom. Like a Vesuvius, too, the tank of must has its eruptions, blowing up when mishandled, exploding like so much dynamite, tearing off the roof, mangling and tossing you. After a few days of this, the wine is drawn. The first wine. Much the best. It is pumped and piped into a second set of tanks, as though it were so much water, and there left to simmer and ferment again, after which it is finished wine. But all the juice has not been pressed from the grape yet. After the first wine is drawn, the stuff that still remains in the tank is called pumice. The pumice is shoveled out into cars and dumped into the hydraulic press. Very slowly, like some great, cruel, relentless tax gatherer. Such as one is read about in the histories of the Middle Ages, the last drop of its lifeblood is wrung from the fruit, the press gripping it with the grip of an immense fist, the blood oozing out between the fingers. This is the second wine, very thick, full of color, not so highly prized as that drawn from the tanks. Even yet, one is not through with the fruit. There is still something more to be squeezed from it. The pumice has now become the cheese. The pulp and skins rammed together in a solid mass. Very dry, and it is from this pumice that cream of tartar is made, though this process does not take place at the winery. One uses the expression of wringing the last drop of juice from the fruit. But as a matter of fact, the thing is never done. A very great deal of juice is wasted. It is very curious to see how reluctant, how obstinate the grape is after all. How its life still persists in spite of every and all processes of crushing and squeezing. Just outside the building stands an enormous tank into which the cheese is thrown. The spongy, almost solid mass fresh from the hydraulic ram, just released from a pressure of thousands of tons. One would think that surely this has been squeezed dry. Yet leave it alone for a few days and precisely like the must, it will begin to boil a little, to froth, to ferment. You can still draw wine from this, and in fact this very thing is done. Over by the engine house is a small mountain of some sort of brown stuff. Coming closer, you see that it is nothing but countless numbers of stems that the crusher throws back, all brown and dry in the sun. One uses them for fuel. But observe the pile closely. The life of the bunch of grapes persists even here, even amidst these skeletons, these catacombs as it were, this mountain of dry bones. The heap is smoking. Somewhere in the pile, wine is making. Enough juice has remained upon the stems themselves to ferment. But, after all, the first operation seems to be the most fascinating. The process by which the grapes are pressed, the work that the crusher does. Straddled there at the top of the building, its mouth forever open, the clatter of its machinery incessantly calling for more. More. The crusher seems to be some kind of gigantic beast, some insatiable monster, gnashing the grapes to pulp with its iron jaws, vomiting them out again in thick and sticky streams of must. Its enormous maw, fed night and day by the heaped-up carloads of fruit, gorges itself with grapes and spits out the wine, devouring a whole harvest, glutted with the produce of 500 acres, and growling over its endless meal like some savage brute, some legendary mammoth, some fabulous beast, symbol of inordinate and monstrous gluttony. Frank Norris. Once again, the description that Norris gives is of the Casa Delmas winery, run by Delphon Delmas. We covered him in a recent episode, along with his father, a pioneer grape grower in the Santa Clara Valley. The use of vine leaves is another newspaper article. It's about other uses for grape leaves, from making tea, wine, or brandy with them. It just struck me as interesting. It's from an 1869 edition of the Santa Cruz Sentinel newspaper. So this would possibly be Trousseau Gris or Noir, possibly Cabernet or Charbonneau leaves they recommend using. It would be interesting for someone to try it, I think. The use of vine leaves. The use of vine leaves. A writer in the Philadelphia Magazine says, "From the experiments which I have made, I find that on being dried, which should be done in the shade, and infused in a teapot, the leaves of the vine make an excellent substitute for tea. I have also found that on being cut small, bruised, and put into a vat or mashing tub, and boiling water poured over them in the same way as with malt, the prunings of the vine produce liquor of a true vinous quality, which on being fermented makes a very fine beverage, either strong or weak, as you please, and on being distilled produces an excellent spirit of the nature of brandy. In the course of my experiments, I found that the fermented liquor from the prunings, particularly the tendrils, when allowed to pass the vinous and to run into the acetous fermentation, make uncommonly fine vinegar." The topic of this newspaper article is something that we've referenced in previous episodes. It's titled The English Opinion and is from 1889. We discussed some of its topic quickly in the Kanai Nagasawa episode, as well as various CWA episodes. The early California wine industry constantly felt disrespected by New York, England, and France. The praise for California wines was faint and rare, but here we have an article praising them from an English wine writer. The English Opinion. The English Opinion. A noted journal's comment on California wines. When we first read glowing accounts of a pure, wholesome, vitalizing California red wine at 22 pounds a dozen, we must confess that we were skeptical. But a friend in whose judgment we place confidence induced us to visit Mr. C.W. Pearson's cellar, 16 Mark Lane, and there we tasted the Mountain Zinfandel, and we freely confess that we never tasted a pleasanter wine or one with a finer bouquet. The firm also introduced us to a very fine hock, partaking of the qualities of a Johannesburg, but without the elderflower element. This wine is 30 pounds a dozen. There are other wines produced in the same vineyards which ought to become popular. We cannot all, unfortunately, breathe the glowing mountain and sea air, and bask in the splendid sunshine of the Pacific Slope in California, where the Fountain Grove vineyards are situated. But when we drink the Zinfandel, we may be said to be imbibing the best essence of that glorious, invigorating air and sunshine. Mr. Pearson Company have about 100 letters from eminent medical men upon their wines. His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, has become greatly interested in California wines. He says they have the piquancy and flavor of the most original country on earth. Colonel Mapleson says on page 218 of the Mapleson Memoirs, in reference to a visit to the United States with prima donnas, "During our 8 days' journey, I acted not only as a cook, but also as a butler, and our various wines, all of California growth, were splendid. And I was not alone in regarding them as of excellent quality. Singers are not great wine drinkers, but they are accustomed to wines of the first quality, and I may say in favor of the wines of California that they are appreciated and bought for the conveyance to Europe by artists of such indubitable taste as Patti, Nilsson, and Gerster. The cost of carriage renders it impossible to send the wines of California to Europe for sale. But someday, when, for instance, the Panama Canal has been cut, there will be a market for them both in England and on the continent. They are, of course, of different qualities, but the finest California vintages may be pronounced incomparable." The medical editor of the Medical Annual writing on wines useful to the medical man, says, after mentioning another valuable wine, "A better wine than this is the Zinfandel, which is produced on the virgin soil of the California vineyards. It is claimed with some reason that the vines grown on this soil, which is strongly impregnated with iron, yield a wine more nourishing and vitalizing than those which are grown on the phylloxera disease soils of the Bordeaux district. This wine has neither the acidity of claret nor the heating properties of Burgundy, and we have never prescribed one which has given greater satisfaction to our patients. It is full-bodied and has a most delicate aroma, and this is most appreciable when the wine is allowed to stand in a warm place a short time before administered." The Pall Mall Gazette. We'll wrap it up today with this old wine poem I found. It was written for the San Francisco Merchant in 1883 by Daniel O'Connell. His name doesn't mean much to us now, but he was a founder of the Bohemian Club, in addition to editing several newspapers in San Francisco and founding some others. O'Connell was truly one of the Bay Area's greatest literary minds of the time. He led a life rich in the arts. His training was in the classics and philosophy. He spoke multiple languages and would teach them also, along with some mathematics. He boxed, wrestled, fenced, hiked, fished, and camped. He's the type that would probably get along well with Theodore Roosevelt. Kevin Starr, the great California historian, wrote of him, quote, "He loved learning, of which he had a great store. He loved wit and fellowship, and with a tender Irish sadness at their evanescence, he loved the pleasures of sense." Unquote. Food, wine, a well-dressed table, these were some of O'Connell's true loves. And he wrote books helping others to find the foods of San Francisco that would bring them pleasure, like The Inner Man, Good Things to Eat and Where to Get Them. This is a wonderful book of the time, and he runs through topics like the similarities between Tibetan and Native American eating habits, the proper glassware for champagne, winemaking in the Douro, how to cook elephant feet, where to get the best canned salmon, and reviews of some of his favorite places to eat in San Francisco. The beauty of this book is that O'Connell seems thrilled and delighted to experience the different cuisines of the city and is proud of what the city has to offer. He enjoys and praises the Spanish, Japanese, Mexican, Chinese, and Portuguese food from an honest place that you don't always get at this time. Many other authors come across kind of condescending in their looks, but he doesn't. The Merchant is another periodical that doesn't mean too much by that name, but it would soon turn into the Pacific Wine and Spirits Review and document the late 1800s to Prohibition California wine industry like no other. It's the single most valuable resource for this podcast and for anybody doing any historical work concerning California wine. The amount of information this single publication provides is incalculable. The Meeting of the Vines. Written for the Merchant. In a canyon deep and rugged, 'neath the shadow of the pines, sat in pleasant converse meeting the children of the vines. Hardy, somber, rough, and stalwart, Franciscus early choice, pioneer from Spanish cradle, rose the mission's greeting voice. "Hail, strangers from the vinelands! Thrice welcome to this soil, where the harvest's plenteous measures repays the vintner's toil. Not here earth's barren bosom repels the thirsty vine. Rich and generous juices fill us with an essence half divine. Welcome, Johannesburg and Riesling, to this chosen land of mine. Ambrosial, fair, twin sisters, from the margin of the Rhine. Welcome, Semillon, mellow daughter, from the fields of pleasant France. Dear to us thy fragrant breathing, dear thy gold-flushed beauteous glance. Hail, Malbec and Sauvignon, dark-hued brothers of Bordeaux. We shall love thee, glorious strangers, with the Southland's fervent glow. And I mark behind you standing, with vine leaves clustered over, black Burgundy, the red-hued, of the beautiful Côte d'Or. As the river ran and rippled, and the tree-side overhead, onward moved the glad procession, but the mission's daughter led. Muscats of Alexandria and of Frontignan glide on, luscious offspring of the Orient, land of love, romance, and song. Flesh-tinted, florid, hardy, her long robe floating free, flame tokay pungent daughter, from the plains of Lombardy, with Malvasie coquetted, and the Douro's deep-dyed sun, from granitic peaks transplanted, led the laughing damsel on. Golden chasselas, great and noble, golden tint and bright in fame, while Sultana, she the seedless, to the forest temple came. He from Fontainebleau, Sultana from Troy's historic strand, peerless, amber-hued, bright daughter of the blind bard's glorious land. With Zinfandel the foundling, of the forest woodland child, Swipla Noir, rugged offspring of America's great wild, ruby-tinted, balmy-scented, Hungary's daughter full of grace, by the burgher of the mountain, and sweet Grenache took her place. They spoke the mission's daughter, welcome friends, thrice welcome all, to you the future honors of this golden state must fall. No more autumn evenings, as in the olden times, will the mission maids play round me, while the mission sweet bells chime. From the weary old world vineyards, to this virgin land you've come, in Sonoma, Napa, Fresno, you will find a fitting home. For on all the earth's face, believe me, is no spot where nature's sign bids the grape mature and flourish, as in this land of mine. She ceased, then from the others a low sweet murmur came, and they twined the emerald tendrils about their cheeks of flame, and chanted softly, slowly, a paean loud and grand, to the hosts who bade their welcome to our California land. Daniel O'Connell. Thanks for listening today. Like I said, these short story episodes are mostly a place to collect some random writings or topics that don't quite fit anywhere else, but I'd still love others to know about. It's really what this podcast is based around, throwing things out into the world that I think people should hear. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast, and feel free to email Indie Wine Podcast with comments, questions, or feedback. If you're enjoying the podcast, I'd love if you told a friend or wine lover about it and help spread the word. Rating, reviewing, or donating at patreon.com/IndieWinePodcast helps too. It all goes to offsetting podcast expenses like gas money, podcast hosting, research books, and websites, and allows for more episodes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.